You've worked with, gosh, who knows how many, hundreds probably of revenue teams. You've seen thousands of sellers. What do the right ones do right? What do the bad ones do wrong?
What we have the ability to do is we know what good looks like. You see those performers that quarter over quarter over quarter, they keep delivering. And you start to look at their behavior, their actions, and frankly, the mental model that they're bringing to that. And you realize there is some consistency because they started with the fundamentals. I tend to break it down into three very basic things: prospecting, qualifying, and managing to a rhythm.
Every sales team has a few reps who are consistently at the top of the leaderboard. You know the ones. Customers love them so much that they sometimes try to hire them. The notes are clear, the right people are involved in every sales cycle, and quarter after quarter, the deals come in as expected. Do these reps have a secret that makes them so successful? No. What these reps do differently seems basic, because in most cases it is. But basic doesn't always mean easy. Nailing the fundamentals is a great way to stop revenue leak in your own business as a rep, but more broadly for a company too. Jason Chapman has seen just how powerful the fundamentals can be. He has years of experience as a consultant at Bain, time running strategy at the likes of SAP, Qualtrics, and Skillsoft, and is now the SVP of Commercial Strategy and Operations at Infor. He's here today with 3 critical fundamentals that you must master to stop revenue leak and run your revenue like a pro.
I'm Kyle Coleman, sales pro turned SVP of marketing at Clary. Run Revenue is the show where revenue pros learn to stop revenue leak, achieve revenue precision, and grow their companies and careers.
This is Run Revenue Show with Kyle Coleman.
Jason Chapman, thanks for joining the show.
No, thanks for having me, Kyle.
Let's go back to the earlier part of your career where you were at Bain. You were at Bain for, I think, about 7 years. I'm curious what you learned during your time at Bain, specifically through the lens of how to run revenue. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So it's interesting because if I go back to that time, what I loved about Bain is the ability to go from consumer goods to financial services to technology to media, and the pattern recognition that you get across all of these disparate business models, and an understanding that there are fundamentals as we think about this idea of profit from the core. You know, I'm absolutely a convert, and I believe in understanding deeply who your target customers are, what they care about, why you are differentially better than the next guy or gal to deliver on that, and ultimately what it's worth for both sides. And the idea of starting with that core and thinking about leadership economics, and then using that as a platform to understand, well, what's our next adjacent move? Whether it's on an industry basis, a product, or a geo basis, how do you continue to expand? And at what point do you actually realize that you need to reinvent the whole thing? There's just some fundamental shifts happening in the marketplace that require you to rethink your business. And I think having had that grounding and that understanding, it gave me an appreciation for the role that sales plays in the context of the rest of the business. That you can't just look at it in isolation. You've got to understand the trade-offs between your market reality, your product reality, and your financial reality. Because if those aren't lined up, right, if you're not hyper-focused on the customers that you can serve best, and you're putting R&D dollars into the things that they care about, and then making sure that you've got the commitments from a revenue perspective, if you win in that, having all of those 3 things connected, I think was probably my biggest takeaway from my days at Bain.
I want to double click on this, and you explained it, but I think it's worth dwelling on for another minute, because when a lot of people think about the role of sales or the role of a revenue team, they think very literally about that. Like they are the ones bringing in the dollars, and that is their contribution to the business. But the way that you described it, their contribution is far more than just the actual literal generation of revenue. So talk to us a little bit about how the best companies leverage their revenue teams to have a broader impact than just the bottom line.
It's funny because in some ways, if you talk to a customer, sales is a pejorative. They don't want to be sold to. And so I think it's almost a misnomer to think in that, you're right, that very narrow definition of these guys go ask for money and bring it in. I think the reality is in most modern sales organizations, they are stewards of that customer experience. and they are helping to orchestrate that end to end. And even the distinction between sales and marketing is blurring. The distinction between sales and success is blurring as you think about expansion journeys and the evolution of an ongoing dialogue with your customers that feels very different than it might have, 20 years ago when Infor got it start selling on-prem licensed ERP, because the reality is in that old world, you sold on feeds and speeds because you had a captive audience that didn't have a lot of alternatives. You'd sell them a license and you'd walk away for 7 years because the risk wasn't on you. Well, all of a sudden, as we transition to cloud-based solutions, switching costs are lower and there's more choice than ever because of the innovation and funding that has happened. All of a sudden, it's incumbent upon vendors to care about things like consumption and adoption. You can't oversell or stuff the bomb and call it value if you have any hope of somebody renewing down the road. And so all of a sudden, we've got to take on the risk. And as a consequence of that, sales has to evolve in terms of thinking about that end-to-end life cycle and the way in which we engage our customers and focus on value.
You mentioned this blurring of lines between teams internally. And the way that we think about this, and we see a lot of our customers thinking about this, Jason, is through the lens of collaboration. How is marketing collaborating with sales? How are they working with customer success? How are they working with product managers? And we're seeing more than half of the employees that any company are revenue critical employees that have some meaningful impact to generating revenue in some form or fashion. The other thing that you mentioned, though, is the external collaboration, the buyer collaboration. So talk to us a little bit about that. How are the best sellers thinking about working across the aisle with their prospects, with their customers in a collaborative way?
So one of the things that I've observed, if you think about the selling process for a second, think about how painful it used to be to buy a used car and the sweat-inducing sort of fear of having to go in and negotiate and the opaqueness of that process. Well, again, with the advent of modern technology and new ways of buying, think about going to a Carvana or a CarMax or any one of these next generation online dealers where the price is the price.
Right.
There's no hidden haggling and you get a Carfax, you know exactly what you're getting with all of the pictures. You don't have to go to the dealership and they deliver it to your door the next week. That buying experience is fundamentally changed because people recognize, oh, we can create competitive advantage by actually making that purchasing process better. I think the same thing is happening now in the context of enterprise software, because part of this is you are going on a journey with your customer. And I think transparency is incredibly important in that process, to be able to say to someone, here's the conversation that we're going to go on. And there is a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow for both sides, but let's make sure that it's actually a good use of both of our times, because you got to value the customer as much as you value your own teams. And as we're looking at profitability and as we're looking at our sales efficiency, the reality is we have to focus on customer verifiable outcomes before jumping to that next stage and investing even more resources. It's one of the reasons that, as I think about our AEs having an early business conversation, if your customer isn't willing to agree to give you access, data, expertise, and most important, time to do proper discovery, you're not setting either of yourselves up for success. Right. If they're asking to jump immediately to a demo of a generic solution, again, you're not setting either of you up for success. So I think it is rooted in a deep empathetic understanding of what do the customers need for their process? And we end up becoming kind of digital concierges in some respects as a way of serving up to them what they need. Yes, it's a guided process, but they're often in the leader seat, not us sort of force marching them through a process.
This is a perfect segue into the meat of today's topic here, Jason, which is, you mentioned before, something that you learned in your time at Bain was mastering the fundamentals of the revenue process as a key to success. Talk to us a little bit more about why that is. You worked with, gosh, who knows how many, hundreds probably of revenue teams, of sales teams, of companies. You've seen thousands of sellers. What do the right ones do right? What do the bad ones do wrong?
Think about the most amazing athletes on the planet. Lebron James, right? when they show the highlight reel, it's these amazing dunks and steals and just this energy on the floor and the rings and the accolades and all of that. What they don't show you are the nights at the gym, the early mornings being the only one on the court, taking shot after shot after shot, the time in the tape room, reviewing, the focus on healthy eating, surrounding yourself with the resources that you need to be successful. They don't show those things. That's where the wins come from. And so when we think about fundamentals for all of us, in terms of revenue generating orgs, if we all had, NRRs north of 150% and we were just crushing it, we probably wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about bookings. If our bookings were wildly off the charts, we probably wouldn't spend that much time talking about pipeline. Well, when our pipeline's not off the charts, then you start talking about activities. And it starts there, right? Because what we have the ability to do is we know what good looks like. You see those performers that quarter over quarter over quarter, they keep delivering. And you start to look at their behavior, their actions, and frankly, the mental model that they're bringing to that. And you realize there is some consistency to that secret sauce because they started with the fundamentals. It's one of those things, we sort of talk about common sense not being that common, but, I tend to break it down into three very, very basic things that if you can't get these things right, it's hard to get any of the other stuff right. And it comes down to prospecting, qualifying, and managing to a rhythm. And let's take each of those apart. Prospecting. There are a lot of different ways to bring customers to the table, right? And this, sort of gets to the earlier conversation about this blurring of the lines between marketing and sales. I think there is very much an antiquated view in some pockets of the world that say, well, I'm expecting BDRs to just hand me leads on a silver platter. My job's to close them. I don't subscribe to that because for me, I think about not sort of siloed functions, but I think about this integrated team that is there to serve the account. And this idea of marketing generating leads, throwing them over the wall to sales is the wrong way to look at it. So my partner in crime is our CMO. And shout out to Kelly if you're listening. And the reality is our organizations are paired at the hip every stage of the customer journey, whether it's early stage awareness or right before you're going to close the deal and surround those decision makers with ABM. All of those, it's the air war and the ground war having to work in concert with one another. And you got to talk to each other. Otherwise you bomb your own troops. And the reason I share that is when I think about prospecting and engaging customers, it's about orchestrating all of those resources. And the idea being our reps have to be owners of their own franchise. And that means you have to think a quarter plus one, quarter plus two. You have to actually build a sustainable business, not just close the deals that are going to ring the cash register now. And that focus on how to prospect well, it's an art. It's not easy. Think about how many cold calls you get or how many of those sort of tailored outreach messages you get. Which ones do you actually pick up the phone on? It's actually really hard because what it does is it sets the foundation for ownership. That I have to be actively involved in contributing to the evolution of my pipe. Yes, partners help, marketing helps, but I've got to have ownership over my package.
One other thing I'll add to that, Jason, as you reminded me of this as you're talking, is we're seeing this evolution happen in B2B sales where more and more and more people are getting involved in a buying decision every passing year. I think when last I saw it, the average at a 500-person company, so not even a huge enterprise, a 500-person company, on average, 11 people are involved in making that buying decision. Now imagine if you're selling to a 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 person company, how many people are going to be involved? So thinking, if you're a seller and you're thinking, oh, my SDR or marketing is just going to create the right MQL, throw that lead over the fence, and I'm going to be in touch with the right person who's going to make that decision, you are setting yourself up for massive failure. That is not how people buy anymore. And so you have to be engaged. You have to do the proactive prospecting, identifying the whole buying group, building thorough account plans, being personalized. I think you're spot on.
Well, and it's funny. So that actually then gets into the next one, right? Which is all around qualifying. And part of that for me is I care so deeply about not just our sellers, but our pre-sales teams, our value engineering teams, all of those sort of incredible experts that are required to drive that orchestration. Their time's really valuable. And if you're not properly qualifying that opportunity and you're kind of throwing resources away just for the sake of responding to an RFP that you're never going to win, not really a good use. And so, I think as you were sort of saying as well, one of the things that we're doing at Infor right now is we're installing MedPay, fairly standard industry practice. But the reason is qualification is not a one-time event. You continue to learn more at every stage of the relationship. And to your point, if you don't understand who the economic buyer is, or you don't understand your champion, and more importantly, you think you're going to close this deal, but you have no idea your path to signature, that's a problem. And so it's putting in rigor and discipline to make sure that we're asking ourselves the right question and challenging ourselves. But again, this is just codifying the stuff that our best people do naturally. Yeah. And I think the thing that's most important about that, again, as we think about that transition to cloud-based economics and loyalty models, is it is all rooted in a deep understanding of how customers make money. Right. If you don't understand that, if you haven't torn apart their 10K, because, oh, by the way, all the answers are there. It's not a secret. They're right there. But if you haven't done that homework, you've not earned the right to talk about your technology. And that, I think, is really fundamental to, the way things have continued to evolve. Because again, we're no longer just chasing existing budget, especially for large scale purchases like, an ERP. The reality is we have to secure unfunded mandates. And that requires us to be able to speak in the language and the value drivers of the industry and those roles. Again, that's why I keep coming back to it. It's not feeds and speeds anymore. Right. Doing that is really hard.
And you mentioned this key phrase that I want to drill in on and really emphasize, which is earning the right to sell to them. To tell us more about that, you're mentioning pulling apart the 10K. If they're a private company, of course, there's a million different avenues you can go to develop that kind of acumen about their business. But tell us more about that. How are you helping your sellers earn the right to sell?
So we just had our SKO last month, and the theme of that kickoff was oriented around the three things that you need to develop a successful relationship with your customers: just substance, empathy, and trust. And that is how you earn the right. So when we talk about substance, a CFO or a CIO is only going to give us their valuable time if we've got something to say. We've got to demonstrate that we have a differentiated point of view because we have helped solve similar problems for relevant peers with the proof points to back it up. We have to be able to tell them something different about their business, or at least have a perspective on what's going on with their industry that they're going to care about. The challenge with that is not enough. You also have to demonstrate deep empathy and curiosity about their business. This is where if you jump to the technology conversation too soon, you miss an opportunity to really hear what are their aspirations? What are they afraid of? What keeps them up at night in terms of shifting customer preferences, competitive threats, regulatory requirements? And what are the operational challenges and hurdles that have prevented them from achieving their goals? Again, if you don't have that before and after state and an understanding of what good looks like, you're missing the opportunity to have a much more holistic conversation that goes beyond, oh, I want to solve this one narrow problem. And you recognize that that's just a symptom of a much bigger root cause that deals with an end-to-end process rather than two steps in the process. And so, that's where trust comes in. You have to deliver on your promises.
You mentioned the implementation of Medic. In fact, you told me in a previous conversation that one of the first things you did when you joined Infor was implement this sales methodology. So first, take 30 seconds to explain what MedPick is for those of people who may not know, and then talk about why this was so top of mind for you to implement when you joined Infor.
So MedPick is a very simple, and there's different variations, by the way, different combinations of letters, but it basically boils down to a series of questions that you iteratively ask as a means to understanding your customer. And it starts with understanding their pain. So the I in MedPIC is identified or implicated pain. Let's start there. And then it evolves. It's understanding what are the metrics that you care about, right? What are the decision criteria that you use? Is there competition in there? Are you talking to multiple vendors? And it's also things like understanding the paper process. How do you make decisions and what does it take to actually get signature? Those things allow you to have a richer, more consistent dialogue. But again, it's just like I said, it's when we talk about the fundamentals, these are the things that don't change. In every single buying cycle, these are relevant. What I love about it, though, in its simplicity, is it allows you to have one common taxonomy and a language between your BDRs and your reps so that when you're looking at your opportunities, you're actually qualifying them on the same basis. Similarly, by documenting all of this and putting it in the system, all of a sudden you have this amazing artifact that you can give post-sales that helps demonstrate an understanding of the customer's expectations. So that again, the delivery teams can take that and say, oh, we need to deliver against this, which enables us to engender that trust. And so for me, one of the reasons that we put it in is that MedPIC is a secret backdoor to value selling. It is the first stop on a series of stops that allow you to get closer and more comfortable articulating value in terms of how do you think about the industry specific sort of operational drivers and the implications for where those benefits show up, either in the P&L or the balance sheet. It's a way to start that conversation. It is also a great place if you've not got a fully robust sales process with clear stages, what I call the 5 A's, the activities or jobs to be done, the assets to leverage, those may be a template or a tool, the artifacts you have to deliver that are instantiated for that customer, the agreements you have to reach in order to progress, or accountability, who does what when. If you don't have some of that stuff defined, MedPIC's actually a great place to start because it helps you think through the stages of when you ask the questions, who's providing input to those and engaging at different stages. And it allows you to have much more cohesion as a team. I'm a huge fan.
You're giving some just amazing frameworks for how to think about things. I'm going to repeat a couple of them for listeners here. To earn the right to sell, it requires substance, empathy, and trust. Love that little formula. Jason's spot on. And then you've just mentioned the 5 A's for tracking, for deal tracking to align with your MedPIC or whatever sales methodology you choose. Activities, assets, artifacts to share with the customers, agreements to make, and then mutual accountability. Talk to us about this concept of mutual accountability. I'm curious to hear how you go about architecting that and enforcing that.
It's not easy. I'll start there. Accountability is a hard one. And this is where, again, as I think about the importance of trust, it's trust within the team, but it is also trust between the two different parties, the customer as well as the team. And you build that over time. And it's one of the things where the best sales teams that I have ever worked with, one of those teams may or may not be employed by Clary. They felt like extensions of my own team. And I don't know how to describe it. Honestly, when I would pick up the phone and talk to my AE or any of the other number of folks that were there in that account, there was no question that they were committed to my success personally and the success of the organization. But what it allowed us to do, because we had that, I'm going to use a framework from Frances Fry, business school professor at HBS, who's amazing. And she talks about sort of how do you actually develop that trust and what does it take? It takes two things. One is a really high bar. You have to hold the line on what good looks like.
Yep.
And again, push each other if you're not. But the only way that works is if you have deep devotion to each other. And that, I think, is part of what comes along, because if you're just sort of going along and saying, this isn't good enough, and beating up the other party, it's hard to believe that you're actually working together towards a common goal.
That's right.
And that's incredibly important, because otherwise it sets it as almost an adversarial conflict versus we are trying to mutually create value for one another.
That's right. It's not sitting across the table from each other, having an adversarial conversation or negotiation. It's sitting on the same side of the table, working off the same laptop or the same paperwork, and truly working together to find a mutual solution that works for everybody. I love that. So let's put a wrapper on this overall framework that you talked about, the three main things: prospecting, qualifying, and then managing to a rhythm. Let me say about qualifying real quick. You mentioned that qualification is an always on thing. And the reframe that I've seen the best sellers, the best revenue leaders have is you have this old sales mantra that you should always be closing. You know, people watch Glenn Ross and they think that that's how to run a sales bullpen. But really, the mantra should be always be qualifying. And you just talked through a masterclass in how to actually do that via a sales methodology. Talk to us about managing to a rhythm. I feel like you've already given us a little bit around this topic, but tell us more.
Yeah. So I think part of the intention there is as you build out a franchise, and again, you think about what the best FLSMs or best sellers do, there's a very consistent rhythm to how they run their business. And the way that I think about it is every day, week, month, quarter, and year, what are the conversations you need to have? Up, down, and across. And for every one of those conversations, what decisions do you need to make? What actions do you take? And therefore, what critical pieces of information or insights do you need? And linking those all together to make sure that we're having robust coaching conversations in a way that's going to allow us to make the right decisions, both in quarter and for the future. And part of the reason that I'm so passionate about that is think about the number of times that we just blast our people with reports and dashboards or information, and we say, go figure it out, as opposed to saying, here's how to have a really good dialogue, let's say between a BDR and an AE. You should be having this dialogue once a week. Here are the things you should be talking about. And oh, by the way, here's the tools and the insights in terms of your pipeline health and your conversion rates that will allow you to have a richer dialogue. And here's where you go, and here's how to interpret the data together. And if you do those sort of things and you stretch that out, the idea is you should be able to take your best seller from Bangkok or Bangalore and move them to Boston, and they will be equally successful in that franchise model because everyone knows the operating rhythm of the business. And that consistency is what allows you to make sure that you're not just sort of over engineering to in quarter, close these deals and have sustainable growth.
Love that, Jason. And this is something that we hear all the time from customers is that they are thinking about their revenue as a business process, and they're thinking about the ways to make sure that there's a ton of collaboration that's happening between teams, but there's some process governance that's informing that collaboration. We want to make sure that people are talking about the right things, are doing the right things at the right time, to your point, are having the right conversations, making the right decisions with the right data. So how do you find that balance between collaboration and governance? Because a lot of people will think that they're polar opposites, but we think of them more as a yin-yang relationship.
And it's funny because I've had these conversations, folks that have been selling for 10, 20 years and have gone to Winner's Circle or Circle of Excellence, any number of times. And there's absolutely initially a resistance, or at least it's a perception that this is just a bureaucratic box checking exercise, right? And I can absolutely understand that perspective if it didn't work. That's the thing. We didn't just make this up magically to sort of make it harder to find time in your day. And this is one of the sort of amazing things. I don't know if you looked at organizational network analysis. There was a company, I'm blocking on its name, I think Microsoft acquired it. But basically, it could look at the patterns of your communication on the basis of emails or calendars. It looked at who you talked to and the frequency of those interactions and the depth based on the responsiveness and the back and forth. And you could actually visualize an informal network across an entire organization. Well, imagine if you look at those patterns and then you overlay quota team. You're able to detect what it is that those consistent sellers are doing. And it turns out they are doing this managerial cadence. because that rhythm of making sure that they're having those right conversations, doing that consistently with rigor and discipline. And the best part is when you sort of look into those, it's not about a question of are the meetings happening, but are they high quality conversations? And this is where the importance of coaching comes in. It's not about check the box. You've actually got to go in and inspect. And this is where skip level interviews, right? If you've got a second line leader, they should be listening in to their first line leaders' conversations and saying, hey, you applied MedPick great here, but you missed it over here, and challenging each other so that you can learn from that process. It's not a static dialogue. It's about how do we improve the richness of those conversations over time.
You've talked to us a lot about the fundamentals for reps, for managers, and you're nibbling on the next topic, which is what are some fundamental ways of thinking for executives? A lot of times, again, the executives will think, oh, every business is different and we need to do things our own new way and we need to figure it out for ourselves. But I have a sneaking suspicion, Jason, you're going to tell us that there are some fundamentals that execs can do regardless of your industry or sector or anything like that.
It's funny because it comes down to a degree about core competencies and where are you spending your time? And for me, I don't want to recreate the wheel. Maybe that just makes me inherently lazy. I don't know, but I'd kind of rather take some best practices off the shelf than figure out through painful trial and error all on my own. As we talk about some of these frameworks, like I get to borrow from phenomenal leaders, Jen Morgan, Eric Stein, all of these people that I've worked with to be able to sort of create my own playbook now, but I didn't make all that stuff up myself. I saw and recognized like this is working. And so I'd say the same thing is true for other leaders, regardless of industry or the segment that they're approaching. There are basic things that you can do that will massively accelerate your business and allow you as an individual leader to focus on the things that make you great, where you can differentially add value. And, ironically, it's kind of how I think about our own products at Infor, if I'm being honest, which is our whole pitch is we have served as the stewards and the guides for many, many customers in a very small number of micro verticals. And so we've taken those best practices and we've embedded them in the product so that you get value day one. Now, again, could you get something massively customized and bespoke that is perfectly suited to every one of your existing processes? Absolutely. But I don't know, if you want to get value faster, sooner, maybe we actually just stick with the standards and then not worry about customizing all these processes and focus instead on the value of our data and the insights from AI, ML, RPA, et cetera. Maybe that's where we should focus our time. And so for me, a lot of this stuff is just the basics of how do you free people up to drive more value-added activities.
Super helpful. I'm going to switch back to this overall concept of the fundamentals, Jason. We see all the time when these fundamentals aren't happening, it leads to breakdowns across the revenue process. It leads to revenue leak. Your reps aren't managing their deals properly. Their forecasts break down. You can't trust the forecast. You can't forward invest. You can't make decisions. I'm curious to hear about a time that perhaps this happened to you or you saw this happen at maybe a company you were consulting for. What happened and what did you do to fix it?
So, one of the interesting things that I've seen is lack of pipeline is the root of all evil. And the reason I say that is it leads to a whole host of really bad behaviors. When there's not enough to go around, think about it. The increased friction between inside and field, increased friction between field and the channel. And more importantly, it starts to leading to bad choices. You start to go after revenue you probably know you don't have a good shot at, or it leads you to sell things that maybe you shouldn't have or the customer didn't need, which is terrifying. And so for me, if you don't have enough to go around, it means it's a 5-alarm fire. You have to focus a lot of resources and attention against that. And again, to make it everyone's problem, because if your view of pipeline, and again, it evolves in terms of what you need. My sort of silly analogy is I think of it as the pyramid, the diamond, and the inverted triangle, which is, in your current quarter, you want everything to be pretty advanced in terms of the stages and where it's in the funnel. The next quarter, you want it to be sort of middle way. Quarter after that, you want stuff to be at the top. Pretty simple. if you don't have that quantified and you're not looking at not just the volume of the pipeline, but the velocity of the pipeline through, it's the movement through that. If you're not looking at that, and it is not on an executive dashboard that you are looking at every week, you're not going to get the managerial attention and focus that it needs. Now, again, you can get it back on track. And there's things that, once you sort of solve that, and you can sort of take your foot off the gas a little bit. But the hope is that you're then building a repeatable muscle that sustains itself.
Building that repeatable muscle, building that real cadence to run revenue is exactly what you've talked us through today at the rep level, the manager level, the executive level. It's just an absolute masterclass in thinking about revenue as a business process that can be run, that can be broken down, that can be optimized. So thank you so much for the time here, Jason. I got one last question for you. I'm curious, and I suspect I know what your answer is going to be to this, but what book would you recommend to executives, to sales managers, sales leaders, revenue leaders, specifically for the topics we talked about today, all around thinking about and implementing the fundamentals? And you're not allowed to say Andy White's book about Medic, because that seems like too low of hanging fruit. So pick something else.
It's interesting. It also signals to me that I should be reading more books right now. No, I think I actually go back to Cialdini.
Influence?
Right. Around influence. Because it starts with understanding human psychology. It's about behaviors. It's not about systems or tools or frameworks or processes. It's getting folks to do something differently on Monday morning that they wouldn't otherwise have done. Because part of my job is to sell the seller. And so I come back to influence because those are likewise the fundamentals for how you manage change. And then understanding what's going through someone's head and what they need in order to break that barrier of old patterns. I just go back to an oldie but a goodie.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Jason. Jason Chapman, SVP Commercial Strategy and Operations at Infor. Really appreciate the time. Have a lovely rest of your day, my friend.
Don't let what you heard today go to waste. Take 2 minutes to download today's checklist to get your priorities in line for the week. You can find that linked in our show notes. And if you liked what you heard, make sure you give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. We'll be back next Monday with more to help you win your week.